Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. People respond to incentives. Let me tell you a story. After the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, an urban planner in London received a call from his colleague in Moscow. And the guy called him and asked, "Hey man, how does the bread system in London work?" And the urban planner is like, What do you mean? Like, what do you mean the bread system? Like, who's in charge of it?" And the guy in Moscow goes, "But surely such a complex system, someone's got to be in charge of it, right?" He's like, no, I mean, I haven't really given any thought to it. But it basically organizes itself. It organizes itself. That's an example, the bread system, right? It's an example of a complex social problem that's basically self-organizing. And that's a very powerful insight. Because when we want to solve a complex social problem, most of the time, the right thing to do is to provide an incentive and allow people to adapt to the new framework and decide how they want to work around it. That's the theme of our presentation today, incentives.
So, what are the problems are we having? Malaysia is experiencing rapid urbanization. And with rapid urbanization at the same time, we have a low ridership of urban public transportation. And these two things, high rapid urbanization, low ridership, leads to congestion. And I don't even have to go into the details of how congestion frustrates you, bring you stress, incur external costs. You know it, right? But my main point is that if congestion is a worry today, we are looking at a gridlock in KL in near future. Why? Let's take a look at this chart. It basically shows you the projected urbanization rate and UPT ridership. Guys, by 2020, we will be reaching an urbanization rate of 75%. And right now, our ridership rate is only at 20.8%. It's a huge gap, massive gap. But my main point is that, yeah, you go through congestion every day, but it cannot be overlooked just because you tolerate it on a daily basis. As policymakers, we must be able to have a long vision. If this thing is left unchecked, again, we're going to a gridlock. Which is why we think that it's so important to increase UPT ridership to mitigate the effects of urbanization. And the question is, how? How do you increase ridership of UPT?
Right, so we've identified 6 push-pull mechanisms that we believe incentivize urban public transport usage, right? On the left, you have the pull factors, accessibility, reliability, and comfort. And on the right, the push factors. So if it takes more time and more stress to drive to work than it does to use urban public transport, then you're going to choose urban public transport. I want you to focus on the top 2 items, comfort and cost. We believe these 2 factors hold the most potential for us to motivate people to take urban public transport. This is a Gantt chart of our proposed solution. So it's an implementation timeline, basically. And it's a 2-phase plan. The first part is a stopgap measure that comes before the KVMRT and the BRT. And the second part is a more long-term solution. So the first part is a pull factor, basically attracting people to ride public transport. I talked about comfort earlier, and basically our idea is to decongest peak hour services, working within the existing supply constraints of public transport. We have to attract people. And if ridership is at 150% capacity during peak hours, that's a problem. Once we have decongested the bottleneck, then we can push people away from private transport. We can discourage them from using their private vehicles to drive to work. And finally, we can add in another pull factor to sweeten the deal. Introduce a loyalty program that rewards regular and continued usage of public transport.
Allow me to go into specific details regarding the 3 incentives that we have in the policy. As my colleague mentioned earlier, it's divided into 2 phases. Phase 1 is when the KVMRT is not yet available. What we have is a stopgap measure. Okay, granted it's stopgap, but it's essential. Now what we do is we spread ridership out by offering free fares to early riders. Ladies and gentlemen, if you take a moment of time to imagine yourself back on the LRT station during peak hours. You push and jostle your way through the crowd of commuters to try and hope to board the train, only to find at the last minute the train doors slam in your face. The train pulls away, leaving you stranded on the platform. The irony here is, If you were in the exact same position, just a mere 2 hours beforehand, well, again, you are alone on the platform, but for an entirely different reason. Very few, or if not negligible amounts of people use off-peak public transport. So how do we do this? Again, as I said, we incentivize this. We give off-peak free fares to commuters willing to travel before, example, 7:30 a.m. Now, what this does, besides, okay, the main point, we decongest the system, we spread out this thing, because the status quo now is a disproportionately high distribution of commuters in a very short time frame. If you're able to have this uniform distribution, not only is it decongested, we'll also have a higher efficiency of utilization of current systems, which now are only at overcapacity in a very small time frame. And back to comfort, we are able to incentivize more commuters to use it because comfort is one of the top 3 reasons why people don't consider using public transport. Now it's too congested, it's too uncomfortable. If we are able to reduce the density, we can bring people out of their cars and into the trains and the buses. Now, some of you may be asking, is it that easy by just tweaking fares that we can have such a huge effect right here? Then I'll like to direct your attention to the data we have right here. This is a study done recently by IIUM. Right now, as it stands, our public transport has an 80% ridership of what we consider as low-income people. These people have monthly incomes below 1,500 ringgit. So, let's put this in perspective. If you're able to encourage these people to get free fares every day, that can translate to a saving of up to 150 ringgit monthly. Now, maybe for some of us here, 150 ringgit is a little bit, not too much. But then again, go back to cost sensitivity. For them, it is a relatively large portion of savings that can be given back. Add to that the fact some more, that within this 80%, we have single workers. We have loads of students. In fact, students take up one of the top 2 majorities right now who use public transport. For them, cost sensitivity is a major issue. If we're able to play with this, we're able to encourage them even more to just take that extra hour to go to off-peak transit. This brings us in part to the philosophy that we have today regarding policymaking, especially in public transport. Far too often and far too much have existing policies been influenced by current demand. Why not turn the tables? Transition from a reactive public policy to something that's proactive. I hope you can take this back today. Why not have something proactive? We are now controlled, we are responding to demand. Can we turn the tables, manage the demand through our policies? I'll give you the example which comes back to here. The current, tried and tested, mind you, but what is current solution by authorities such as SPAD, when we have a problem like over-congestion, is to increase the capacity of the infrastructure. This involves increasing perhaps more rail lines, creating more rolling stock, decreasing headway. But this involves hardware, infrastructure, things that are costly. Add to that some more the time lag between the identification of the problem and the implementation, and you have a problem here. Find something which we propose to do, which is low cost but high impact, proactive. Don't look at the hardware, look at the commuter. Why don't we tweak their behavior via incentives, which brings us back to what we hear today. Not yet. Now, as my colleague mentioned earlier as well, we marked the beginning of operations of the Klang Valley MRT as a benchmark point in a policy. Now, some of you may be asking why. Well, let's use this as an example. The employment of a single MRT train carriage allows 1,200 commuters the option to transition to public transport. This is the equivalent of 20 fully loaded buses or 700 cars worth of commuters off the road. Now, why is this important? Right now, as it is, we have 700,000 people on the rail system. You look at the cumulative effect of each and every train which will be implemented by 2017. The MRT in phase 1 itself will give riders another extra 450,000 spaces in ridership. That corresponds to an increase of 40% over the total existing all the rail shares. We suddenly have this huge influx of possibilities and options for riders to transition to mass public transit. And this gives us the resources and the options available to progress to phase 2 of our policy.
There are so many cars on the road. In fact, there are too many cars. Why? People don't pay the full cost of driving. They don't realize that when we drive, we take up a certain road capacity, and because of that, we impose the external cost on someone else. We make someone go through air pollution. We make someone suffer from stress. We make someone waste unproductive time waiting for you to move. And what's worse is, you don't pay for any of this. How is this fair? Our policy, we suggest that we would levy a congestion charge to internalize social costs. The first thing we would want to do is to implement congestion charge only on private vehicle users. This is because we don't want to hinder commercial activity. We don't want, say you are a bus driver, a taxi driver, a truck driver. We do not want you to, you will not incur any of the congestion charge. Secondly, the congestion charge will only be implemented at peak hours during peak times, at peak areas. Now, how would we roll out this policy? Imagine that you just bought the car. The first thing you should do is to register your payment car and your vehicle with the relevant transport authority. And then the next day, you want to go to work. So you drive through a congestion zone. And then what happens to you is that immediately, a congestion charge is taken away from your payment card. This is why we think that a congestion charge is a strong push factor to incentivize people to move away from private transport to public transport, especially when the MRT has come to completion at this pace and when supply has been increased.
As with any policy, I'm fairly certain that most of you agree here that policies that only include deterrence, the stakes, are not widely accepted. They will not be widely agreed upon by the masses. So we go back to psychology. We've shown you the carrot in phase 2. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to present to you the carrot in contrast to the stick. Now basically, what we can do is we can create a loyalty program to incentivize commuters to have regular, frequent, and most importantly, increasing uptake of urban public transport. I'm sure many of you in this room have heard of the frequent flyer programs done by airlines. We have people from any enriched people here? No? Any big points, perhaps? Now, bringing this idea back to the context of public transport, we already have frequent flyers. Why not create frequent riders? Create a program, Rapid Points, for example, that enables commuters to receive rewards, journey points that correlate directly to the amount of distance traveled within the public transport system. Create a policy, create a system where they can then directly exchange these points for more free journey miles or for other privileges relating back to transport. What we have here then is the beginning of a cycle where we encourage more and more public transport users to go onto public transport. For example, they start with a journey on the rail line. We give them free miles. This incentivizes them to continue back on the journey, and again, we give them more rewards. The cycle builds on and on. It's a self-sustaining cycle, nothing more needed than capital startup. And what's beautiful about this is that it can serve as a seed in Malaysia for a public transport culture, where people under the program, they feel a sense of pride of belonging at a world-class public transport system that they can be part of.
Right. We've heard a lot about incentives, right? Economic theory tells us incentives work. But incentives don't work uniformly. And that's why we need targeted policies to influence different groups of people more effectively. What you see on the slide is an income distribution. On the left, we have the poor, the price sensitive, those who rely on public transport almost exclusively. And on the right, we have the rich people, those who will drive to work every day even if we charge them 100 ringgit, right? Our policy intends to push people at the margins towards public transport. So you see the blue circle, the blue oval in the middle, that's our target audience. See the first red line? The free fares for early riders. We think that the most price-sensitive consumers are the ones who will be most incentivized to wake up earlier, travel earlier, reach their destinations earlier in order to take advantage of the free rides. So that's one portion of consumers shifted to an earlier service, which then decongests the peak hour service and makes it a more comfortable experience for people who still want to travel at peak hour. Next, we have congestion pricing. So it pinches your pocket and pushes you away from private transport. Tells you, leave your vehicle at home. It's expensive to come into the city center, park there, waste petrol, driving into the city center. Take public transport instead. So we push another like 20%, 30% of people towards public transport. And finally, the loyalty card, which we hope will encourage continued and regular usage of public transport through a feedback loop. So when you get a reward, your brain thinks, this is fun, let's do this again. Right.
So we've heard about the policies, and what's important next is about stakeholders. Stakeholders engagement is crucial in order to increase buy-in. And our first stakeholders is the current UPT users. Let me share you my experience when I take a public transport in London. What's amazing about it is that initially I thought that it's all run by Transport for London because the branding, the logo, the fonts are all same. They conform to the same branding. But to my shock is that they are operated by many different private sector operators. But take a step back and think, if you can replicate this experience in Malaysia and form this seamless connectivity, increase public ridership perception, that would be great. So this is the first stakeholder engagement. Second, it is private transport vehicles, as in the passengers. So like people like you and me, how can I attract you to take public transport? I know problems like unreliability and not punctual and stuff like that. So we want to address problems like first mile and last mile, which are already being addressed by Pemandu in GDP 2.0. But what's important and what we are proposing is information dissemination. Communicate with people. Tell people that what are the KPIs that are being achieved, what are the new policies, what are the cheaper alternatives. And lastly, as government, the stakeholders, what government should do is to make sure that the revenue collected from congestion are channeled back to the UPT ecosystem for the improvement and maintenance of public transport. So whatever is taken from the rugyard is given back to the rugyard. At the end of the day, you're going to ask me, what do you want out of this? If you're looking for an objective measure, a numbered goal, I'll tell you our KPI is to achieve 40% modal share in urban public transport. But it asked me again, what do you want beyond 2030, Livia? I want to live in a livable city with a sustainable urban public transportation system. And how do we do it? Incentives. Because incentive shapes demand, and influence behavior. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting and very, very specific compared to the others. Only one question. Where is your original proposal? Because if you listen carefully, your proposal is essentially has been implemented in Singapore and London. For example, Singapore last year, 2013, they had the free ridership. I think it starts for free up to a certain time, and if you go closer to 9 o'clock, it gets you 30-40% discount. The congestion charge been in Singapore for a very long time, implemented in London for a very long time. So where's the originality, and why do you think that the consumer behavior in Kuala Lumpur specifically will mirror those of the riders in Singapore and London?
Right, I'll deal with the first part of your question first. I'll be very frank. I mean, our proposal isn't original. Like, sure, it's been done in London and Singapore before, especially a free rides and the congestion chart. I mean, even the logos we use were from London. But a policy doesn't have to be original for it to be good. When you talk about public transport, most of the smart stuff has already been done. And if it works, I don't see a reason why we cannot implement smart policies that work elsewhere in Malaysia. You may take away originality points from me, but as far as feasibility goes and as far as things that work go, I think we've got a pretty good chance. Now for the second part of your question, right? You said, how do you think in a Malaysian context these things would work? In Singapore, we saw 7% of people shifting from the peak hour to the non-peak hour in their experiment. The people who take public transport in Singapore is like basically everybody. And in Malaysia, with poorer people, more price-sensitive people taking public transport, we think that there's an even greater incentive for them to wake up earlier and take the earlier services which are completely free. Because like 150 ringgit a month is 10% of their income. A room costs 300, 400 ringgit. Like, half of that they can save just by waking up earlier. We think that price-sensitive consumers tend to gain a lot from waking up earlier. Does that answer your question?
Very well answered.
Thank you.
Now that you've sighed your sigh of relief, can you say how you improved on what you copied?
All right, I think Livia is going to handle this one.
Well, I'm not gonna lie, but basically the whole brainstorming session, we've tried to come up with grand schemes of policies and whatnot. We tried to come up with something sexy that could wow everyone. But essentially, what's important is to create a low-cost, high-impact policy. And what's the difference is that you cannot just copy policy and say, right now, I want to do it. It's not like that. As a public policy maker, you have to take into account of the macroeconomic condition. What is the existing infrastructure? And what's special about this is that we have taken into account of that. The reason being, there's BRT coming up and MRT coming up. We have analyzed the supply capacity of MRT before actually thinking about something like congestion charges. And because of that, we realized that actually this stopgap measure and long-term solution can be implemented right now. So it comes back to the macroeconomic condition and the physical infrastructure. So yeah, that's how we add value to it. Thank you.
Coming to your practicality question, I think I like the presentation. I like the incentives angle because I believe that is an angle that's completely missing from our existing public transport policy. But I would like to perhaps focus on the practicality point which you raised because I have to ask questions. Is that you have KV MRT that covers from Kota Damansara down line to Kajang. You have several other lines of BRT perhaps and your some bus routes around. Based on existing information we have, that is still far from adequate for Klang Valley. The MRT line is only the first of perhaps three or more that needs to be built. Integration to buses is lacking. Number of buses is I can't even find the right adjective for it. Is disastrously lacking. So when you put a congestion charge on people who don't have access to buses or MRT, for example, if I'm staying in, say, somewhere in Sri Kembangan or Serdang where there's no MRT coming, wouldn't that be unfair on me when I have no other option? That's one. Number two, congestion charge problem for Singapore, very good, because they're all trapped on an island. In Malaysia, you have got people coming from Kedah visiting KL. So based on statistics, for example, Selangor KL vehicles is about 8 million, including motorbikes, and nationwide is 22 million. So in that sense, fixing all your fancy gadgets on the car, the cost will overwhelm if it's implemented nationwide. Was that considered an issue? And question number three, just three questions, don't worry. Question number three, I was particularly attracted by one slide, which Livia, I think, just browsed through, which is the comparison between here and UK, the stakeholder slide, and the fact that you have one logo, multiple operators behind the scenes. Perhaps you would like to elaborate how that model can be applied in Malaysia. What's the compare, contrast, benefits, and how that can improve efficiency in Malaysia? Thank you.
Okay, let me try to rephrase your first question. So basically you're saying that some people aren't going to have access to stuff like MRT or BRT. First of all, MRT is going to allow most of Klang Valley commuters, 50% to be exact, to make their journeys after it's implemented. The BRT will increase that percentage even more. We understand that there are bound to be people who are going to fall between the gaps, who are never going to be able to do anything but drive. First of all, these people are, well, that's one option. No, what I was going to say is that, first of all, these people have the option of, for instance, riding a motorbike to work. Yes, it's not ideal, but we think that people who drive into the city center in the first place are working, most of them are working at jobs that allow them to be able to afford the high cost of the congestion charge. Like, we mean it to be painful. But for those people, you're going to tell me, yeah, you got the high flyers working in KL Central, but equally you have the janitors. And we say, yes, fair enough, it's going to be very hard on them. Perhaps a possible policy would be to exempt people with a certain monthly income below a threshold from paying that congestion charge if you register their vehicles. Alternatively, we implement it only in very specific key areas where we know it's possible for a majority of the population to access there via public transport. Second question was? Out of the client value. Actually, we were thinking about like exempting suburban passengers from the thing, but she'll talk about it. Livia, talk about it.
Well, I think the main thing here, it's very well, said, because like, what about people who doesn't have access to all this public transport? This comes into play where relevant authorities like Prasarana and SPAT, where they have to decide where are the peak areas, where are the peak times in order to set the congestion charges. When we say we do implement congestion charges, it's not across all areas, it's not a blanket solution everywhere. It's important for these relevant authorities to decide where you want to put it in order to effectively target the group. So I think that would respond to your question, and unfortunately, I do not have data and stuff like that. And another part about this, actually I love this slide, but the reason why I have to go through it quickly because Rayan was saying you only have 5 minutes left. So yeah, basically what's great about London is that it gives you a sense and a perception of seamless connectivity. And this is a very crucial factor, and this is one of the determining factor of whether people want to take urban public transport or not. Because most of the time in Malaysia, there are a lot of real problems like there's the first mile and last mile problem. But what we want is that once policy and solution have been pushed out, we also want to increase their perception, refine their perception, to give them a feeling that public transport is actually a great thing, a great mode of transport. So we want to do these two things together, your perception and the policy, which one of the main focus of perception would be seamless connectivity. Yeah.
Okay, how many minutes do I have? 7, okay. I have 2 questions. In coming up with good policies, you have to look at both sides of the coin. Mainly, you look at the positive sides. What would happen? Okay. Can you answer me? You have 3 strategies in a way. One is to incentivize by the free fare. 2 is to introduce congestion pricing, and the 3rd is to introduce loyalty programs. In each of them, do you know or do you foresee any factor that will fail that strategy, that will make that strategy fail? Okay. Number 1. Hold on. Okay. Oh, this is what spot question. Number 2. I'm from Penang. Okay. How do you tweak your strategy? How do you tweak your strategy to achieve the same outcomes in Penang?
Unfortunately, I did not anticipate the first question because we are all trying to brainstorm the pros and not the cons. But I think I can answer one, which is the congestion charge. I think we are very afraid about the enforcement of congestion charge because in London, one of the biggest problem is about the revenue collected, the fines. Because there are loopholes where cars can pass through and do not pay the congestion charges. And basically what they do is to have the cameras to capture the pictures of the car and match it with a central database of whether they pay or not. So I think it's more on the law enforcement and all these loopholes where people can escape fines and whatnot. And I think that's one of the cons of congestion charge.
As far as the congestion charge goes,
Others. 2 more.
Oh, 2 more.
One answer. We have 2 more incentives and 2 more. Sorry, 2 more.
2 more policies.
So for example, free fares, what will happen if it fails? We could first start out by a one year trial project. So then we let the gates open at 6 to 7 a.m. in the morning. We let whoever come and ride. So we realized that nobody comes to ride the train. So what is wrong with this? In the first place, it's already empty. So if it continues to be empty, we don't lose anything, right?
So yeah, that's why essentially, public policy at the very beginning phase is always a social experiment. And what's great about this is that if this social experiment eventually fails, the loss is actually not that big, which is why we think it's feasible. So she's answered the first one. Third one.
You can jump to second question if you want. Yeah. Penang. Let's talk about Penang now.
Now, okay, so Penang, quick analysis. Basically, Penang has some things in common with KL. Basically, we have the same public transport, we have Happy Penang. Good thing that we took something from Singapore because Penang is also an island. Yeah, so what I can give here is basically I can't back it up directly with data because again we need to do research. But if I correct me back, if you look at the central KL area and we look at Penang, basically population density is about the same order of magnitude. So that's one pro in implementing the same kind of processes we have. Okay, back to the elephant in the room, congestion charges. Now, we have still a majority of industry that is on the island itself. And unlike KL, where you may have loopholes, where you have roads leading in and out, which we cannot tax because of certain policies, we only have 1 bridge, 2 bridges now, maybe 3 later, but still 3 gates. And we don't even need to have extra hardware there. All we do is we impose extra toll pricings when they pass through the toll. We don't even need to have any automated gate systems and all. That's already part of implementation. So maybe that way, congestion pricing could be something that is more feasible in Penang. Loyalty programs and the...
People are not loyal.
Yeah.
Can't do anything about it.
Yeah. Okay, problem people may not know.
So one thing that Singapore has done, which I don't think London has done, is they have intelligent pricing for congestion charging. So especially for a case like Penang, where you got, like he said, like several entries and exits, which is actually the case of Stockholm as well. They got so many rivers that they only have a certain fixed number of entry points to the city, right? So what they do is they change the pricing for entering the city depending on how congested the bridge is at a certain time. And that's pretty easy to do. I mean, all you need to do is you measure the average speed of cars that are traveling on the bridge, and you implement a charge that reflects it. I mean, this is like thinking off the top of my head because like we really haven't done any research into this. We weren't thinking that you would ask about Penang. But I'm just imagining, right? You could have a device or some sort of smartphone app that tells people that, look, historical data has shown that if you travel at 8 a.m., man, you're going to get charged 50 ringgit. Please don't travel at 8 a.m. You're going to get stuck in a jam. You're going to pay a lot of money. Why don't you travel at 9 a.m. instead or earlier? You get charged less or nothing at all, and you'll make your journey faster. So perhaps that's something that could be done.
Okay, well done. May I respond just? First of all, Penang requires a rail system. Overall, okay? So that's number one. Number two, I think one thing that you may not know is for congestion charging to work, we must have a good database of our road users, which we do not have. And the third one, I think you have undermined one important factor is the fact that motorcyclists will actually use your public transport, not necessarily car users. Okay, this is an assumption that a lot of people cut short because they feel car users will use them. But in Malaysia, motorcyclists will use them first. So the effect that you foresee of 40% might not be gotten within the short time. You know, you have that large 60% of our commuters are motorcyclists. But well done, well thought, and thank you.